So now that we've made some decisions on appropriate organization and form, it's time to put all that into a visual format that starts to look like a layout. And what we call that is a wireframe. A wireframe is a skeleton of a screen. What it does is it shows the priority and the organization of things that are on the screen. All right? It tells us how people are going to get to each specific part of the site or the app or the system. It represents the basic layout and organization of all the screens, the wayfinding mechanisms, demonstrates how you're going to interact with what's being presented. Wireframes reflect the designer's ideas about placement of elements on the page, the labeling of those elements, navigation, how you're going to get from one element to the other, and functionality, behavior, and feedback. When I interact with this piece, what does it do? When I click this button, what happens? When I pull down this menu, what choices do I have? Think of it as sort of a very finished looking rough sketch. A wireframe is a way to work through multiple concepts and multiple ideas about how things are organized and how they work. It's just like sketching in a sketchbook, except in this case, we're doing it in a bit of a more concrete form, usually using a piece of software on the screen. While wireframes vary in their level of detail, the important thing to remember is that at this point, we're not making any true visual decisions about how the finished product is going to look. We don't care about fonts. We don't care about colors. We don't care about specific images. We don't care about the look and feel. All we care about is how much information do we have, how much of it is there, how is it organized from screen to screen, how is it organized on each screen, and how are we going to fit it all on the surface of the screen. We're dealing with issues of form, arrangement, and information volume. Some wireframes are nothing but literal rough sketches, like in this example that you see here. In this case, there's no actual content, okay? We're sort of substituting some scribbles and lines for areas where there would be text. That's okay. It's a good place to start. You're just trying to figure out, in general, how's the stuff organized. And it allows you to work really quickly because you don't have to be bogged down by the details. The goal is just to iterate, right? Create as many ideas as possible. I typically do this actually in a sketchbook, a notebook that I keep with me. And when I'm at this stage, I generally will create, 25 to 30 of these for any given screen, just because I'm trying to think at a high level about how much stuff do I have to deal with? How many different types of information do I have? I don't care about what they say. I don't care about what they look like. I don't care what the actual words or labels or buttons are. I'm just trying to figure out how much do I have to deal with. This type of wireframe offers a higher level of detail. Okay, you can see that things are beginning to get more concrete, such as the fact that you can see that we're using tabs for navigation. We have an obvious title, hotel name, rating. We've got navigation immediately below that. We've got a large image that's our sort of core leading hero image, if you will. We've got boxes underneath that segregated for subsequent images. We've got a form that lives on the right-hand side of the page. This particular approach is fleshing out some of the functional details of what the page or the site is actually going to do. How are we going to interact with it? What types of controls should be on the page, and what do they do? But notice, again, there are no specific fonts being used. There are no colors. There are no images. There are no decisions that pertain to, again, what I refer to as finished look and feel, finished design. And in most cases, the finished design, even in terms of some of its formal and structural decisions, tends to not look like the wireframe. Okay, the wireframe is a starting point, but a lot of times as you go through a final design process, you're continuously learning things. You're continuously getting some new information, or you're continuously having ideas about how to make something work better. So it's perfectly normal and acceptable that the finished product does not exactly mimic the wireframe. Finally, I want to show you an example of a rather high fidelity wireframe. Now, this was for a financial organization, and just because of the sheer volume of information we were dealing with, we sort of had to get to this level in order to figure out how we were going to deal with all this information, because there was just so much of it. And there was a ton of interactivity as to how you could filter and view a lot of information in a very small space. So in this case, we did have to have a very strong handle on what's the content, how many characters are in each line, how many categories of information are going to appear in each one of these tables in the center, how are people going to view additional details if they need to without sacrificing the high-level stuff that's already being shown, issues like that. Okay, so at this point, we're definitely operating at a much higher level of detail. Things look a lot more real, and we're even going so far as to use some gray just to differentiate importance and hierarchy or different types of information segregation. But again, I have to stress the fact that even though we're using some grays and this is a lot more real, a lot more like what the finished screen may look like, we're still not making any visual design decisions. We're simply trying to figure out how much of this stuff is there, how are we going to look at it, how are we going to interact with it, how are we going to deal with it, how are we going to expose it. Wireframes are all about figuring out form, structure, and function. So one more time, because it bears repeating, remember that wireframes don't show colors, typography, images, or visual styling of any kind. You can do it in any of the styles and methods that I just showed you. It can be a rough sketch. You can do it on the computer. You can do it using wireframing software. But whatever the level of detail that you're comfortable working with, make sure that you are not venturing into the territory where you're saying, well, I wonder what this would look like if it was red, or I wonder if I use this font, or, this would be a picture of this specific thing. Okay, don't go there. Don't go into the weeds. Stay high level and focus solely on how much stuff you have to deal with, how you're going to organize it, and what it's going to do on the screen. It's at least a dozen times a year I get asked this question: why bother with wireframes? Why do we need to do that? Why can't we just, go to visual design? And that's usually because clients in particular are excited, to see what it's going to look like. And that's the big $1 million question that's on everybody's minds as well, right? What's it going to look like? What's it going to look like? But it is in your best interest and their best interest, more importantly, to back up the process, say time out. We have got to figure out how much stuff we have to deal with, how we're going to organize it, and how we're going to get to all of it, how users are going to get to all of it, how we're going to expose it all to them. The reason we bother with wireframes is because design has to consider a bunch of different things. Number one, how does each screen fit in with the site or the app or the system as a whole? Number two, what content or links or interactions do we need to meet both user and business goals, right? We've got two camps that we have to satisfy here, and we need to make sure that we're addressing both. Next, we have to consider how all of these elements relate to each other. How do we make the experience consistent? How do we create context? How do we send the signal that item A is related to item D is related to item Q? In larger systems and larger applications, that can be a very complex problem. And unless you take the proper time to create wireframes and really think about the sum total of all the stuff that you have to deal with, what's going to happen is you're going to get into actual visual design, and then you're going to have to redo it. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, probably at least a dozen times. And if you're doing design and development at the same time, it's even worse. Because every single time you discover that you've missed a piece of information, or you haven't accounted for something, or the client surfaces a piece of information that you didn't know before, you're going to have to tear it all down and start again. Tear it all down and start again. It's a really wasteful way to go about doing this work. The reason you want a wireframe, the reason you want to do multiple iterations of wireframe, is because it's cheap, essentially, in a number of ways, to change them. There's no high level of detail, okay? These are just shapes and text. So if you do miss a feature, if you do miss a function, if a client brings something up 3 months later that they forgot to tell you, it's easy to accommodate for it. You don't have to tear down a bunch of stuff. It's simple, it's quick, it's easy, and on their side, it's cost effective. So here's an example of what I mean. This is a situation where incoming documentation gets scanned, processed, and then shipped out to multiple parties. Okay, so I'm glossing over it, but it's a very complex, convoluted process, and there's a lot of information that has to be captured at all stages. So we start with our main interface, which is sort of on the left, and we say, what choices does that person have available to them? Then when they choose something, what happens? And you can see that there are sort of a series of offshoot windows and elements that happen in a sequence. That's an interaction sequence. I do this, then I get this option, then I execute that option, and now I have something else that comes up as a result of that. It's a complex process, and it goes on and on and on. This particular wireframe, you can't see it, but it's about 4 times as long as what you see here. It just sort of keeps going to the right. Okay, we pasted this on a boardroom wall in order to see it all. Doing this allowed us to see every aspect of the process. It allowed us to clearly look at, okay, do we have everything? Have we accounted for everything? Are there any actions that people need to take that aren't accounted for here? So doing it this way saved us a tremendous amount of time and money by the time we got to finished design. When we get to the visual part, it's just a matter of skinning all this stuff. So here's what wireframes tell us. When you're looking over your new set of wireframes that you've just created, there are several things that you're looking for to make sure that they're represented. And those are what content will be included, how that content is organized, which parts of that content are most important, where a given screen's location is within an entire system, where users can go, and what they can do when they get there. And finally, you're trying to clearly establish how users will move around in the system. Remember, you're dealing with something that is the sum of all its parts. So not only are you dealing with separate screens, but you're also dealing with the way in which a person moves from screen to screen to screen to screen, right? Different types of interactions, different types of workflows. Those are all things that your wireframing should expose. At this point, I want to give you sort of a crash course in the wireframing process. I'd like to give you some general idea of how it starts, how you work through it, and sort of where it ends up. The place to start is by revisiting the needs and goals that were established way back in the strategy phase of the project. Okay, things like, why is this valuable to my intended user? What can it do to make their life better? How can I make it easier for them to take action? What actions are most valuable on each screen? Not only on each screen, but across the entire system. And finally, how can I measure the impact of this action? This is sort of a gut check against everything that you've done so far, everything that you've uncovered, everything that you've decided, everything that you've been exposed to up to this point, right? All the decisions that have been made prior to now should be revisited to see if they still make sense. The second thing that we do is we establish what are called cores and paths, and I'll explain. Cores are the primary pieces of content and functionality that you want people to see and you want them to interact with. Those are the most important elements, not only on each screen, but in the app as a whole. Paths, on the other hand, are what users take to enter and leave each screen. Okay, pretty straightforward. Your goal here is to prioritize content on the screen, number one, and then delineate clear paths for people to get to and from those screens. How do I get there? What's there for me when I arrive? And then how do I leave? How do I go to the next, adventure? So to delineate all these things, we use a form that looks like this. At the very top, we're reiterating our core user needs and our core business goals. In the center of the page, you've got 2 main categories, right? Our core content and functionality. Okay, what's going to be exposed on this page? What content is there and what can people do with it? We also have supporting information, navigation, outgoing paths. Again, what has to be represented on the screen? On the left, these are incoming paths. These are all the places you can come from to get to this page, this screen. On the right, you have outgoing paths. How many exit paths are there? There's probably, for instance, a piece of main navigation that takes me to another page. But there may also be a process that I start on this page. For instance, filling out a form that may take me somewhere else. So you're kind of creating an inventory, right? How many incoming paths do I have? How many ways are there to get here? And how many ways are there to leave here? At the bottom, you make more notes. Things like trigger words, which are essentially suggestions to take action. What are the key labels, key concepts that need to be expressed? Core elements is just a bucket list, okay? What are all the core things that have to be included on this page? That's just to make sure that we don't miss anything. And on the far right What are the calls to action? What are the primary things that we are asking the user to do once they're here? So all that stuff together gives you an idea of what your cores are and what your paths are. How do they get here? What do they do while they're here? And then how do they leave? What you need to do next is start sketching. Now, you'll be tempted to skip this phase. Don't do it. Okay? In the computer age, everybody wants to go straight to the computer because, well, I work on my laptop. That's what I do, and I totally get it, right? You have all these awesome tools at your disposal, and it just seems easier to do it that way. I'm telling you, don't take the shortcut. There are no shortcuts. Going through this phase, if nothing else, will help you get rid of all the garbage that's floating around in your head, okay? It'll get things that you've already seen that are influencing you that probably aren't appropriate out of your head onto the paper and will allow you to think more clearly as you move forward. So the goal here is to quickly generate what are called thumbnail sketches. The reason we call them thumbnail sketches is because they're really small. Some people actually do sketch little boxes that are about the size of your thumbnail. I generally work a little bigger than that, probably, 3-inch boxes, let's say, that represent the screen to me. However you do it, your goal is to get down several decent ideas of what these screens should look like or could look like. You're just going. Sketch out an idea, and the minute it starts to feel like you're overworking it, move on. This is usually anywhere from 60 seconds to 2 minutes at most per sketch. 60 seconds is a better rule. Just do it, move on. Do it, move on. Do it, move on. Do it, move on. Don't get hung up on things. Don't get attached to things. Don't fall in love with what you're doing, okay? As a professor of mine used to put it. Don't think about usability. Don't think about information hierarchy. Just get as many different ideas out of your head as possible. What you produce in this step should look no more detailed than this. They're sophisticated scribbles at best. Okay? Just do it. Do a lot of them. Do as many as you possibly can, and then evaluate them later. Take this step now, and you will thank me later. I guarantee it. So now that you've got a bunch of sketches in your hand, you probably also have some pretty good ideas about how to start laying out the screen. And the next step that you want to take is to start prototyping rapidly. We use the word rapid because this is very similar to the method you use when you're sketching. You work very quickly, you put all your initial ideas down on the screen, and you iterate, okay? You change things where they need to be changed. You operate a lot on instinct, but it's also very informed by all the work you've done up to this point, right? We've had a strategy, a scope, and a structure phase, and we've done a lot of underlying work and a lot of underlying thinking about how things are supposed to work. And that should enable you to move quickly because you've got all this sort of backstory that's already in your head. So the first step is to find a tool that works for you. Okay, some people use Visio. Some people use its Mac counterpart, which is called OmniGraffle. Some people use a wireframing tool called Balsamiq. I personally use something called Axure, A-X-U-R-E, that I think is excellent. And the thing I especially like about it is that it's very easy to turn your flat wireframes into clickable HTML prototypes. It automates all that. So that's my recommendation, but you can use any of those tools. Do not, however, use PowerPoint or Illustrator or InDesign, etc. Okay, and for two reasons. Number one, the types of tools that are built into those programs take more time to use and execute than the tools I just mentioned. All right, so number one, you're going to spend way too much time just creating the things. What took you 30 minutes in Balsamiq or Axure will take you 3 hours in PowerPoint or Illustrator or InDesign. Okay, so number one, there's a time suck. Number two, when you're using those tools, you will be tempted to select specific fonts and to play with line weight and to apply even color and all those types of things. You'll be tempted to start designing. So you want to use a tool that is sort of bare bones by its very nature. Next, try not to use lorem ipsum text, okay, which is placeholder text. If at all possible, you want to be working with the actual content, the actual words, the actual labels, the actual fields, buttons, etc., that are going to exist on the screen. Content is just as important to the design as your button placement and your navigation elements and all that stuff. So anytime you're working with real words, real labels, That's the way you want to go. And finally, as you go through this, remember that you're iterating, okay? What you're creating is not final design, and it's not anything close to it. You do not have to be married to any of the decisions that you make. They can change, they will change, and they should change as you go through the process. Again, this is rapid prototyping. You're trying to get out concrete ideas of what's on the screen, how it works, how people interact with it, and you're trying to do as many variations as possible. Build it, quickly refine it, quickly revise it. Once you've created a substantial set of wireframes, once you feel like you've accounted for at least all the core parts of whatever it is that you're building, it's time to review what you've got. And again, once you get to the point where you feel like, okay, this is a pretty good representation, it doesn't have to be perfect. It may be 70% of the way there. That's okay. Take a break, go back, review it, and ask yourself some important questions. Number one, is anything important missing? Have I left anything out? Are there any things that we talked about prior to now that aren't represented here? Is the most important content noticed first? Have I done a good job organizing this stuff and prioritizing it in a way that the most important stuff is what the person sees immediately, when they would come to this page? Next, is there anything here that shouldn't be here? Is there anything on this screen right now or on any of these screens that, made sense a month ago or 2 months ago when we were talking about it as a feature or a function or a piece of content, but now that I look at it, I don't think anybody's going to care about this. I don't think anybody's going to use this, okay, whatever the case may be. Or have I inadvertently, added some things that maybe overcomplicate the process? So again, is there anything that's here that maybe shouldn't be here, doesn't need to be here? What parts of content are related, not only on a single screen, but across multiple screens? What parts of this are related, and how are they related? Is there a need for people to be able to navigate across them? Is there a need to have pieces of each bit of information in front of the user as they're executing some other task? Okay, you're looking for relationships. You're looking for things that sort of stand up and say, hey, I'm related to that other thing over there. The final question is, can you get to all the major areas from where you are right now? And maybe a better question is, should you be able to do that? Just because you can doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right idea. Maybe there is a specific structured path to get to certain content or certain workflows. But either way, it's an important question to ask. How can I get around, and can I go everywhere that I need to be able to go from where I am right now? Do all the labels make sense? Do my labels use full words instead of cryptic acronyms or abbreviations? When someone looks at my navigation tabs, are they going to know what those words are and what they mean and what they're supposed to do? When they look at buttons or menus or controls of some sort, are all those things labeled in a way that it's going to be clear and obvious to the user what that piece of functionality does or what it's intended to do? When someone comes to this page, do they know what all the elements are? Is it all going to be understandable, recognizable instantly? Is the purpose of each one of those elements clear? Yeah, I have this stuff in front of me, but am I going to know what to do with it as a user? You have to ask yourself if the flow of tasks or the flow of information matches the user's needs or expectation. Okay, is this in line with what they're trying to accomplish? And is it what they would expect to see in going through that process? Are there any parts of it that would sort of cause them to question it or say, well, why are you asking me for that information? That doesn't have anything to do with what I'm trying to do here. You're looking for situations like that where there's a disconnect between what's happening on the screen or what's shown on the screen and what that person would be thinking or would want to be doing. And finally, are there any additional features or functions that are necessary, right? Are there other things that I need to be able to do here? A lot of times when you go down the first set of wireframes, you're designing what are called happy paths. And that means that everything works perfectly, right? The person logs in and has no problem with the instructions and fills out the form perfectly with no errors and sends it off, and all is happy, all is bright in the land. But you haven't accounted for errors and exceptions. What happens when they fill out a form incorrectly? What kind of feedback do they get on the screen? What kind of instruction to correct that action do they get on the screen? What happens when there's an exception in processing They fill out everything correctly and hit send, but for some reason, the system freezes or crashes or otherwise misbehaves. What happens? What do they see on the screen? What does it do as a result? What kind of feedback does it give them? Okay, those are errors and exceptions. Those are instances where you say, you know what? We probably need some additional things that we didn't account for. So I hope all this sheds light on the fact that wireframes are a critical step of user experience design and interface design, because there's a great deal of complexity that has to be accounted for, and you can't do it all in one shot. You sort of have to work your way up to it, improving as you go.